You're listening to an event from the U.S. Institute of Peace, part of the USIP podcast network. For more information about our work around the world, visit usip.org and check us out on social media.
All right, welcome everyone to the U.S. Institute of Peace. My name is Frank Aum, and I am the Senior Expert on Northeast Asia here at USIP. For those of you who are not familiar with USIP, we are an independent, nonpartisan organization that's fully funded by Congress, and we're working on the goals of conflict resolution and mediation, as well as peace building. So last year, the United States and North Korea United States and South Korea commemorated the 70th anniversary of the end of the Korean War. And most of the celebrations were focused on the military aspects, so things like the founding of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, the establishment of the U.S.-South Korea Mutual Defense Treaty, and the sacrifices of the soldiers and veterans of the Korean War. But what was often ignored last year was perhaps the most important part of what happened in 1953. So after 3 years of military conflict and bloodshed that cost well over millions of lives, the United States and North Korea used diplomacy to agree on an armistice or a truce that ended military hostilities. It was the longest negotiated armistice in history. 158 meetings that spread out over 2 years and 17 days. In a televised address, shortly after the armistice was signed, President Eisenhower had these words to say, quote, "So at long last, the carnage of war is to cease, and the negotiation of the conference table is to begin. On this Sabbath evening, each of us devoutly prays that all nations may come to see the wisdom of composing differences in this fashion before rather than after there is resort to brutal and futile battle." Another significant aspect of the armistice agreement was that the military commanders on both sides recommended that a political conference be held to resolve what the war could not. And that political conference ultimately was held the next year in 1954 in Geneva, Switzerland. For a variety of reasons that Mark will get into, that conference did not succeed in resolving the Korean question. And then for the next 70 years, the United States and North Korea basically have not held any serious discussions to resolve the Korea question. So today's event is in some ways a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the 1954 Geneva Conference. What happened at that conference and why did it fail? That's one of the questions we're going to get to today. Today's event also broadens the discussion to look at U.S. policy towards North Korea in the past in general. Why haven't the two sides been able to achieve peace over the last 70 years? And then we also look forward. Given the profound shifts on the Korean Peninsula over the last couple years, including North Korea shunning talks with the United States, abandoning peaceful unification with South Korea, and establishing a comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia, what does this all mean for the future of U.S. policy toward North Korea? We have two fantastic speakers who will address these issues, and I'll introduce them quickly right now. First, we have Mark Tokola, who is sitting next to me. He's currently the Vice President at the Korea Economic Institute of America in Washington, D.C., but about to retire in a few days. So again, we're very thankful that you're spending some of those last days with us. You've had a long and illustrious career in the Foreign Service, which included a post as the Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul, South Korea, and ended with the rank of Minister Counselor and a posting as Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in London. And most importantly, for the purposes of our discussion today, Mark, you've researched and written about the 1954 Geneva Conference, so we will benefit from your expertise. Our second speaker is patching in remotely from Hawaii, retired Lieutenant General Dan Leaf. General Leaf is currently the director of Phase -1 LLC, and he has more than 33 years of military service. This remarkable career includes serving as deputy commander and acting commander of U.S. Pacific Command, Deputy J3 Operations at U.S. Forces Korea, and significant time as a U.S. Air Force pilot with missions in Iraq, Serbia, Kosovo, and Kuwait. He was also director of the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii and has been published widely, including in the New York Times op-ed section and as the recipient of the 2017 Oslo Forum Peace Writer Prize for innovative responses to peacemaking challenges. So let me describe quickly how the event will proceed. I'll first turn it over to Mark for about 10 minutes of remarks, and then I will turn it over to Dan, who again is joining us remotely. And then after that, I'll lead a discussion with the two speakers for about 20 minutes or so. And then at the end, I'll open up for Q&A for about 15 minutes. So with that being said, let me turn it over to you, Mark.
Okay, thank you, Frank, and thank you for inviting me. Most people probably want to get to the present and future, but I'm going to inflict some history on you because I think it matters. What I want to talk about is the 1954 Geneva Peace Conference, which is largely forgotten. There are hundreds of books written about the Korean War. There's not one book on the peace conference. There's some references to it in other books, but it's just not discussed. Before I do that, you need to get back to the earlier history to understand how Geneva happened. Between 1945 and 1950 is another really important time on the peninsula that's kind of forgotten because it was before the war. There are people who believe that the US and USSR divided Korea intentionally and meant to keep it divided. The documentary evidence shows that's not the case. That the division in 1945 was for the purpose of deciding who would receive the surrenders from Japanese forces. Soviets in the north and the US Army in the south. They also agreed for temporary administration. But as early as 1947, there was a US-USSR joint commission that was tasked with reunifying Korea. So in that joint commission, the United States proposed easing the border, so it could be cross-border traffic, common rail system, common road system, common postal service, and there'd be a joint Korean administration as the beginning of a government. Those are all US proposals. The Soviets did not accept any of them and stonewalled. They would not negotiate. So because the Joint Commission was inactive, the United States then supported the establishment of the United Nations Commission on Korea, UNCOC, which operated between 1948 and 1950. The UN mission was to reunify Korea also. That was its goal. It operated in South Korea. It was headquartered there. North Koreans and the Soviets would never allow the UN Commission to even enter North Korea. So more stonewalling. Then we have the war. After the war, the armistice, which I will not talk about, that's for our other guest. But in the armistice, there's an Article 4, which calls for a high-level political conference to resolve the Korean question and withdrawal of foreign troops. Korean question meaning reunification. So the Military Armistice Commission that was established by the armistice had as one of its tasks to prepare for that high-level political conference. This time the Chinese and the North Koreans would not allow that to be on the agenda for those discussions. So it didn't happen. US, again, frustrated because the US government wanted to do something towards reunification. So there was a four-power conference in Berlin in early 1954. It was to discuss Germany, but also discuss Korea. The four powers were US, USSR, France, and UK. And so the four powers agreed to convene the political conference in Geneva that year to deal with the Korean question. Now, it's important this was not a United Nations conference, because after the war, the Chinese and North Koreans viewed the UN as a belligerent. So this had to be something apart from the United Nations. Four powers convened it. The US did not recognize China. So the way it was done in practice was the Soviet Union invited China and North Korea to the conference in Geneva. The US invited the United Nations sending states, those who were involved in the Korean conflict. 13 of those, so it was 13 plus 3, 16 parties were in Geneva. They met from April till June, and this was not a technical sort of a meeting. This was a very high-level conference. If you look at the attendance of the Geneva conference for 3 months, it's a who's who of Cold War statesmanship. The U.S. was led by John Foster Dulles, our side. Molotov led the Soviet delegation. Zhou Enlai led the Chinese delegation. Other people there, Lester Pearson from Canada, Alfred Lunds from Netherlands, Paul-Henri Spaak from Belgium. These were the senior statesmen of the time who met for 3 months. I think the big surprise is how close the conference came to succeeding. And people don't realize that. There are 4 main items on the Geneva agenda. First was withdrawal of foreign forces from the peninsula. And a notional timetable was agreed for withdrawal of both U.S. and Chinese forces. That was set. The second item on the agenda was elections. South Korea resisted having peninsula-wide elections for a new assembly. They said, we had our elections already. Elections should only be in the north. But under pressure at the conference, the South Koreans agreed for nationwide elections. The third issue was proportionality. And by that, the North Koreans were concerned that because South Korea had a bigger population than North Korea, in any kind of a new government, they would be outnumbered and would therefore lose power. So the compromise was there would be a commission established with equal representation, North and South Korea, to develop the form of the new government. That was agreed. The fourth part was supervision of the agreement. On that, the United States insisted the United Nations would supervise the agreement. This was not so much about Korea, but because at the time, the U.S. was promoting a bigger role in the world for the UN. So they insisted on that point. The communists, the Russians, Chinese, North Koreans, insist there be a neutral nations commission that would supervise the agreement. And it was on that point negotiations failed. So that's how close it came. And even beyond that, kind of ironically, the U.S. delegation had in its back pocket a deal to propose in case the conference failed. And that deal would have had practical steps towards unification. Again, back to rail, postal service, some common administration, practical steps, little steps. The Chinese, we know from the post-war archives, had the same proposal pretty much in their pockets. The Chinese wanted to succeed in Geneva because for them it was the first big international gathering. The Chinese knew if they succeeded in making a deal in Geneva, they could go on to be in parts of other international conferences. So they had the will to succeed there. Chinese had their proposal in the back pocket, we had ours, and they never discussed them because there just wasn't a chance to meet to talk about that. How different it would have been if we'd actually had a chance to use those compromise proposals. So I don't want to run the clock out too much. Happy to answer questions about it, but that's a Geneva story. And I think it's worth remembering because of the goodwill that was there to try to resolve the problem, and they almost did.
Great, thank you so much, Mark, and you have left some time to spare. Now we're going to turn it over to Lieutenant General Leaf. Please.
Aloha, Frank. Greetings from Honolulu. Mark, thanks for that overview. I am hoping that you all don't hear the lawn care going on in the background here in Honolulu, but it happens here in my home.
We're good.
Office.
We don't hear anything.
Excellent. Thanks for quality microphone. I'm not going to detail the armistice. I'm going to describe it and describe why I think it's been rendered moot by events and why that mandates a different approach. And then we'll get to the different approach and the discussion with you, Frank. Mark, thanks for that extraordinary overview. I'd love to sit down for a few hours and learn from you. But my first exposure to the Korean environment came in 1978 as a Forward Air Controller at Osan. And my primary job in controlling South Korean aircraft on training missions in the P518 Korean Tactical Zone, as it was called, was to keep them from going too far north. And that is sort of emblematic of the armistice, intended to forestall the renewal of direct conflict between the two sides. And it was intended to be temporary, as described, and we were intended to get beyond that with a lasting peace agreement, and that didn't happen. So it was a Cold War device, from a hot war to the Cold War, and for the years until the demise of the Soviet Union, that really was the role of the armistice at a tactical level, prevent conflict on the Korean Peninsula, and at a more strategic level, retain some measure of peace in the Cold War while facilitating containment of any North Korean or South Korean aggression. And it did that until the demise of the Soviet Union. That's when I think the armistice became less and less relevant to the point where it's almost totally irrelevant today. So there were efforts to move beyond the armistice since the demise of the Soviet Union and the agreed framework. in the six-party talks in the symmetry of the Trump era, but nothing that made pursuing resolution of the Korean War and replacement of the armistice a specific policy priority for the United States. And as the paradigm has shifted, as Kim Jong-un renounced the notion of reunification of the two Koreas, it's even less relevant. I'd like to quote from a letter that the North Koreans sent to the U.S. Congress in 1974, 4 years before I even got to Korea, proposing peace talks or talks to resolve the issue. And I quote, "At present, the armistice agreement has already become outdated and does not conform to the reality in many respects. To replace the armistice agreement with a peace agreement brooks no further delay." 1974, now 2024. It's really time to do that. We can't do that by engaging North Korea right now because they won't. As Frank alluded to, they've shunned contact on almost any matter, and that's because of two hangups, if you will. The issue of denuclearization and the matter of North Korean human rights. Now, those are two central issues because they are two stated U.S. policy priorities, unlike resolution of the Korean War. We have a special envoy for North Korean human rights in Julie Turner. Our senior official for North Korea matters has just stepped down, according to reports I read last week. But those are really two areas where North Korea doesn't want to talk. And if they won't talk, how are we going to resolve the Korean War and establish a lasting peace agreement? I'm not advocating for a unilateral peace agreement. I don't think that's appropriate, but I am suggesting that we need to make that resolution a stated policy priority. And what's the motivation for that? One is to move to a paradigm where we can talk to North Korea and avoid conflict. Two is to lessen the nuclear threat. I think there is a legitimate risk of nuclear war that is greater on the Korean Peninsula than anywhere else. And that was the crux of my article in the New York Times that Frank alluded to. And then there's the moral element of resolving this question. And as a military man for 33 years, here's what haunts me. Well, two things haunt me. One is the conditions under which North Korean citizens live. That haunts me. But what also haunts me is my imagined image of a Marine, a U.S. Marine, during the Chosin Reservoir battles, bleeding out in the snow with his comrade holding him, assuring him that his suffering would not be in vain and that things would be resolved. I think we owe it to those lost and those who suffered on both sides to resolve this issue and move on. So, as I said, the agreed framework was an attempt to forestall nuclear development. So were the six-party talks, and the symmetry settled largely around that issue. They all failed. If we make resolution of the Korean War a priority, perhaps we'll move forward. Now, what can the U.S. do alone? Because all of those failures were failures in negotiation. The failure at Geneva was, in fact, that. So what I advocate for is an internal U.S. policy priority. In my notion, it should be mandated by Congress, that goes after the matters of resolving the war. And there are several things that need to be done. What do we do with the vestiges of the armistice, with the United Nations Command, et cetera? How do we initiate a truth and reconciliation effort, a truth and reconciliation commission from a U.S. perspective? That's got to be done or we're not going to make peace. What are the U.S. positions on boundary reconciliation after we replace the armistice with a peace agreement? There are many other technical aspects that we haven't even begun to address. And I would submit that if Presidents President Trump and Kim Jong-un had walked out of the Metropole Hotel in Hanoi and said, all right, we fixed this, let's make peace, that the U.S. government would have been largely at a loss for exactly how to do that. Formal pursuit of resolution would start the work that has to be done so we don't miss the opportunity. And what of the armistice, since that's really the topic I'm supposed to be talking about, it hasn't been useful. When I was in Korea, it was marginally useful, both in the two terms that, or two tours that I stayed there. The armistice was the structure that both caused and resolved the tree cutting incident. We did not use, if you fast forward to today, without listing all the incidents since then, to the Travis King matter, the armistice doesn't fit the paradigm of two separate Koreas, one of them nuclear, that has renounced reunification. It simply doesn't fit, it's not used, and it should be replaced. So, Frank, I'll stop there, and again, I think your questions will guide us into more fruitful discussion.
Great, Dan, thank you so much, and Mark, thank you as well. So I want to continue the conversation right after the Geneva Conference. It ended in 1954, and then basically another 20 years passed until we got to the point where North Korea wrote a letter. And Dan, you referred to it in your remarks. North Korea, this is Hwang Jang-yup, who was the chairman of the North Korean Supreme People's Assembly, who wrote a letter to the U.S. Congress asking for peace talks. Ultimately, I don't think the U.S. ever responded to that letter. But that was the first time since Geneva where North Korea was seeking talks. And this came right after the Inter-Korean Joint Communique of 1972, where the two Koreas met and they agreed to the principle of peaceful unification and cooperation. North Korea basically decided, well, you know, we agreed to this Inter-Korean deal, but we really need to start talking to the U.S. because the U.S. seems to have a lot of sway on the peninsula. But after that 1974 outreach from North Korea, another 18 years passed until 1992 when the U.S. finally agreed to senior level talks with North Korea. And now we're talking about 38 years that had passed between 1954 and 1992 when the two sides finally met for senior level talks. So Mark, this question is addressed to you, but Dan, if you had any thoughts, you can chime in as well. Why do you think it took so long for the U.S. to agree to talks with North Korea?
I think it's overstating things to say that we weren't communicating with North Korea for that time. In fact, between 53 and 91, the Military Armistice Commission was active in meeting. North Koreans were in those meetings, as were the U.S. representatives. The MAC met 450 times between 53 and 91. It was 1991 that the North Koreans began boycotting the Military Armistice Commission. So I don't think it's a coincidence that that ended in 91, and in 92 you see the beginning of other kinds of diplomacy, other tracks. So discussions were happening. They just weren't mature enough to be able to deal with the big issues of peace. If I can add something?
Yeah.
On the value of the armistice, I take a little bit of a legalistic view towards it. The armistice is in effect. The UN Secretary General has said so. And so there's only three things you can do with the armistice. You can either declare it a success. You can say it achieved its objective, that the Korean question has been settled. There's two states in the peninsula, that's it. Or you can declare the armistice a failure and say it was violated so many times, including by introducing new weapons on the peninsula, it's a dead letter. Or you can try to fulfill the armistice and have that peace conference it calls for. You know, that strikes me as the most useful way to move forward, is take advantage of the fact the armistice, in effect, still calls for peace conference and hold a peace conference.
I think probably the reality lies somewhere in the middle of those three scenarios that you explained. I would probably venture that deterrence on the peninsula has largely been a function of the strength of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, but also North Korea's military, in addition to the armistice agreement itself. My point about the lack of dialogue is, first, Absolutely, you're right. I think there were obviously a lot of discussions through the Military Armistice Commission, but those are military level discussions rather than the senior political level talks that happened between Kim Il-sung and Arnold Cantor in New York in 1992, the first time since 1994. So that was the point I'm trying to make. Why didn't we have the senior political talks rather than just the military to military armistice talks at the DMZ, right?
Well, I mean, if you look at the environment, what was the situation? We had a divided peninsula, and the United States was an ally of one of the divisions, one of the sides. So it's remarkable there's any communications at all given the basic setup. Maybe some other country that was more neutral could have been involved in trying to broker talks. But with a peninsula in which each side claimed sovereignty over the other in the entire territory, having that steep division and having the U.S. allied with one side only, it's amazing they talked at all.
Right, and I would also note...
jump on that?
Yes,
Sorry.
Dan, please.
I think acknowledging the environment and how unique it was in the 90s, in April 1996, Bill Clinton and Kim Il-sung proposed peace talks. What was happening in 1996? I mean, that was a remarkably tense time. I was in Jeju-do when the two met and proposed that. But later that year, on September 17th, the North Korean submarine beached on the East Coast, and we were chasing the North Korean agents around the peninsula. There was an assassination team that was supposed to go to Tuncheon and assassinate Kim Il-sung. Later, a consular official in South Korean in Vladivostok was apparently assassinated. So it was a tactically volatile situation. We're not there now. And back to the tree cutting incident and all of the other tactical environmentals. It was very different. And the armistice, I did serve a tactical role for emergency communications, and it's eroded since 1991 to a degree that I wouldn't declare it a failure, but I think we have to look for other methods to ensure the peace, because the armistice doesn't. It also doesn't deter nuclear aggression. It isn't assisting in the pursuit of improved North Korean human rights. So what would work? I think resolving it and moving on to a peace agreement is the most likely case. Mark, I'd be interested in your thoughts on how do you hold the mandated peace conference? How do you make that happen? What's the approach that would bring North Korea into such a conference?
Shall I answer that?
You want to address that? We can go.
Or try to. Dwight Eisenhower said, if you've got a problem you can't resolve, the way to fix it is to make it bigger. I think that applies to Korea, too. I think that we've had 6 rounds of negotiations with North Korea since '92, none of which have worked. I think the problem is North Korea is not going to be content or feel safe in a neighborhood that's so dangerous. It's a neighborhood that's a problem. There are a lot of unresolved issues from World War II. It's not just the Korean Peninsula. There's still tensions left over between China and Japan. There's territorial disputes. There's unresolved war issues. So what I would suggest is the way to deal with Korea is to make it part of a regional peace conference. This is what Europe did. I mean, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, was convened to deal with leftover World War II issues. It did everything from arms control to human rights to journalism. We're not there today, but someday I hope there could be a conference on security and cooperation in Northeast Asia, where you could make Korea part of a bigger regional settlement. Maybe that would make North Korea feel comfortable enough they'd be prepared to actually make an agreement.
Do you think that the 6-party talks were an attempt to make it bigger, the fact that 6 parties were included and it wasn't bilateral or trilateral?
I think it was a step in the right direction, but the problem again was the 6-party talks were about Korea. They should have been about more issues. They should have been about Japanese disputes too. I think you need to couch Korea in context of unresolved regional issues.
Dan, I wanted to pick up on an issue that you referenced, the 1996 peace talks proposal. So, and again, you said that you were there. You were the J3 operations director at USFK from 1995 to 1997. But in April 1996, President Clinton visited President Kim Il-sung in Jeju-do and proposed peace talks with North Korea. It's sort of a forgotten chapter in history, but this is one of the few times where we actually explicitly proposed talks to address peace. Interestingly enough, North Korea was kind of confused by the proposal, and they didn't respond for 1 year. And then when they did respond, they asked that U.S. troop presence on the Korean Peninsula be on the agenda for talks. And for the U.S., that was a non-starter, and then the talks pretty much dissipated after that. So it's interesting that in 1954 at the Geneva Conference, U.S. foreign troop presence was one of the main issues.
Right.
At the 1996, for those peace talk proposals, North Korea wanted foreign troop presence to be on the agenda. What do you think the role is for U.S. troop presence in terms of peace building in the present day?
Well, I think that it's unlikely, and that's an understatement, that the U.S. and South Korea and the Republic of Korea's allies are going to start by reducing or eliminating the U.S. troop presence, so it's a non-starter. My point would be, we have an incredible collection of non-starters. Sometimes your car won't start. It could be the battery, it could be the starter, it could be the starter solenoid or gas, or everything that keeps discussion from starting is there in this case. The North Koreans don't want to talk about denuclearization. We insist that we do. They don't want to talk about human rights. We don't want to talk about our joint exercises or a reduced troop presence. So whether we're talking about going to direct negotiation with the North Koreans or broader, make the problem bigger, as Mark suggested in Eisenhower's sense, right now we cannot get there from here because of all of the non-starters. That's why my suggestion is that the United States begin internally and make resolution of the Korean War an internal priority that we begin doing the hard work of preparing for. Not in isolation from our Republic of Korea allies, but also not beholden to their views entirely, because one of the challenges is aligning two democracies and the shifts of internal and external views from those democracies. So back to your question, there'll be an issue. There will be an issue until it's resolved, until I guess someday maybe there won't be U.S. troops in the Republic of Korea, but that's no place to start.
I think what makes it very difficult to negotiate with the North Koreans is that they tend to be equivocal on issues. So, for example, troop presence came up in 1954, it came up in 1996, but when Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il were meeting in 2000, Kim Dae-jung mentioned that U.S. troops never came up. And then even in the recent 2018 talks with Trump, Mike Pompeo wrote in his book that, or he wrote actually mentioned in media that U.S. troop presence never came up once during those discussions. So they tend to equivocate on that. Also in denuclearization, North Korea, will sometimes say we're never willing to give up our treasured sword, nuclear weapons. But then in 2018, they agreed to complete denuclearization. So they tend to go back and forth. That it's hard to hold them on certain things.
Yeah, right? I'd like to highlight something that I think was a real failing in 2018. And this is the last 75 years show us how difficult this is, so I'm not blaming or criticizing anybody. But they also equivocated on joint exercises. Approaching the Trump-Kim summits, Kim made one statement that he understood the need at the current time for the exercises. And yet in Singapore, President Trump apparently unilaterally suggested or said that we'd halt those exercises. That's an unforced concession that I think led to, okay, if we can ask for that, all the other things that have been non-starters in the past will resume asking for. So, like I said, it's an incredible collection of non-starters right now. So how do we start on our own with things that we can deal with unilaterally, internally, from a U.S. perspective? And perhaps that will draw North Korea into a discussion.
So, Dan, I appreciate you bringing this to the current day. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that we have a precarious situation because of what I think are some very major strategic shifts on the peninsula of the last couple of years, right? One is, again, like I said, North Korea refuses to engage with the U.S. That's a shift because in the past, from 1974 to 2019, North Korea has always wanted to engage with the U.S., and we've had the leverage and the stature to say yes or no, right? But since 2019, the tables have turned, and now it's the U.S. that is seeking unconditional talks with North Korea, and North Korea is saying, we're going to pass, right? That's one. Two is North Korea has abandoned peaceful unification with South Korea. That's a change in long-standing policy since their joint communique from 1972, right? An over 50-year policy. And then third is this comprehensive strategic partnership between North Korea and Russia. You basically have two nuclear countries, one being a P5 member of the UN Security Council, saying that we are going to counter the US-led international order, right? That's a very dangerous situation. So my question, and this is addressed to both of you, based on these shifts, this very dangerous environment, is there a realistic pathway for the U.S. back to talks with North Korea?
Well, I'll jump in and Mark will give a better answer after I finish. I think there are two potential approaches. One is the one I described, begin the work on, from a U.S. perspective, on resolution and see what happens with that. There's no guarantee that North Korea will be drawn into discussion, but why not? I think the other is, it seems to me that we've under-leveraged potential partners in interaction with North Korea. In the armistice framework, there are set folks with stakes in the game, neutral nations, supervisory commission, et cetera. But what about countries like Mongolia and Vietnam as alternatives, as interlocutors, separate from the armistice? Have we fully used approaches through those partners, not allies, to try to engage with North Korea? I don't think we have. And so that's the second option that I'd aggressively pursue. I think, before the first summit in Singapore, I advocated Hanoi as the original venue, and I think that would have been more productive, and also advocated in writing a role for the government of Vietnam as an interlocutor. I still think that could be an option, especially given the comprehensive strategic partnership that began last year between the U.S. and Vietnam. Now, I have to, in full disclosure, acknowledge that I am Vietnam's honorary consul in Hawaii. They're only honorary consul in the U.S. That's an unofficial position, but that does explain some of my lean towards using the relationship with Vietnam to engage with North Korea.
Mark.
Realistically, not much is going to happen anytime soon. We are kind of stuck. I think you're correct. The Biden administration has tried really hard to engage North Korea. North Korea is just not answering the phone, and true of South Korea too. And it's no longer a case of denuclearization in exchange for sanctions relief. That's a dead framework. We need to do something different. Biden himself, the president, has said publicly, twice I've heard, that the ultimate goal of the United States is denuclearization of North Korea. Well, that word ultimate can mean most important, or it can mean end of the road. And I think it means end of the road for him, that we were prepared to talk about anything else before then. It's no longer a precondition. It's something to kind of strive for. I agree that we're probably not the best partners to try to engage North Korea now. And I've talked about Mongolia and Vietnam, too, as being likely avenues. When we looked like we might have had Japanese-North Korean talks, the U.S. government said, great, feel free. Anything that works would be a step in the right direction. The other organization that I think could play a helpful role is the United Nations Economic and Social Committee for Asia Pacific, Northeast Asia, SCAP. UN SCAP is a group of 6 countries. There's Russia, China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, Mongolia. They're actually active. They actually meet and do things, but they do it very under the radar. So I think if the time came we could talk about economic reform in North Korea, I think the UN SCAP mechanism is one that the North Koreans are used to and wouldn't mind accepting. But this is all down the road. Today, it's not good.
Right. I think it's helpful that you bring up the idea of third-party facilitators, because in 2018, South Korea served that role with the Moon Jae-in administration, but it's unlikely that the current Yoon administration would be able to play that role, right? But it's good to look towards countries like Mongolia, Vietnam, maybe some of the Scandinavian countries that have relations with North Korea as well, right? You brought up an interesting segue, the role of denuclearization. I want to pull on that thread a little bit more, but also get to the idea of policy priorities. Dan, you've written for us the idea of making the end of the Korean War, resolving the Korean War, making that a policy priority for the U.S. government. I would say at the moment, our policy priorities when it comes to North Korea is deterring aggression, which we've succeeded at over 70 years. And over the last 30 years, our policy priority has been denuclearization, right? So my question is, does denuclearization need to remain a policy priority for the United States, or is that unrealistic at this point?
I'll go first this time so you can follow me with a better answer. I don't see any reason to give up on denuclearization as a long-term policy. It doesn't have to come first, and we don't have to define what it means, but why give up on the idea? As a step for a future goal after everything else, keep it. I mean, one of the great successes of the 20th century was non-proliferation treaty. And if we decide to give up on denuclearization with a country like North Korea, who's going to be next? I mean, in the world today, only North Korea and Iran are pursuing nuclear weapons programs. That's quite remarkable. But if North Korea had nuclear weapons, then what happens next? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, South Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, a lot of countries, UAE, maybe would have nuclear weapons. So we might have 30 nuclear states. Trying to draw the line at Korea and say, let's denuclearize with them somehow, someday, I think is a sensible policy.
Yeah, my response isn't a better answer. It's an amen. The importance of the non-proliferation treaty, I really don't think can be exaggerated, and all we have to do is look at discussion of South Korea perhaps developing its own internal nuclear capability to recognize that it must remain, as Mark said, the ultimate goal. But Frank, I'm going to push back a little bit on your assertion that deterrence has worked and say, I think that depends on your definition of deterrence. We have not resumed to trench warfare or fighting for high ground across the DMZ, but that's about it. I mean, there have been issues and incidents throughout the period of the armistice, some of which were very hot war-like, some of which were very cold war-like, like the assassination attempt on Chun Do-hwan in Rangoon. I actually escorted his 747 back from Rangoon in my F-15 back in 1983. So what have we deterred? Open warfare. We haven't deterred nuclear development. We haven't deterred their human rights abuses. We really haven't deterred anything except shooting today at this point in time. And I'm not convinced we're deterring or preventing the a potential nuclear conflict, as I wrote in the New York Times. With a very broad experience in the nuclear world, as a strike pilot, as a leader, supervisor, decision maker, we're one bad decision away from a nuclear exchange with North Korea. And it isn't likely necessarily, but it is absolutely possible. So we can't be happy with the status quo.
Well, thank you for raising the status quo, because that leads me to my last question. You make a fair point. I was talking about deterring a major war, but of course, like you said, there's been many minor conflicts, aggressions, provocations, and certainly North Korea's development of their nuclear program over 30 years. We deterred none of that, right? But status quo. So my question, and that'll wrap up this portion of the event, what is wrong with the status quo? And I think this is probably an argument that some officials, maybe a lot of Korea watchers, will ask. What is wrong with just the U.S. and South Korea continuing to keep North Korea in a box and trying to manage the situation through pressure, containment, deterrence, and sanctions? Because that's essentially what we've done for the last several decades. What's wrong with just doing that?
I'd say roughly everything. So, and I shouldn't be glib about it, but my passion for this issue comes from my time as the deputy commander of Pacific Command, and hearing civilian leaders from both sides and some military leaders come to the headquarters and say the status quo was fine. It's not fine. I mean, the risk of nuclear warfare is not fine. Just as importantly, from a moral perspective, the condition, the suffering of the North Korean populace is not fine. And we're already 70 plus years into it. And I think it's inexcusable not to work aggressively to find a better place. So, we can't turn a blind eye to the risk or the suffering.
Thank you. Mark, you have the last word.
Well, I'll say amen to that. I mean, the status quo is dangerous, unsustainable, and inhumane. We shouldn't settle for it. We're one accident away from a war. I'm much less worried about a deliberate North Korean decision to attack than a mistake. Some senile general hitting a button, some whale being mistaken for a submarine. I mean, it is dangerous. And I'm not sure that we have the ability to work down a ladder of escalation with North Korea anymore. I don't think North Korea is built to do that. If you look at their nuclear war doctrine, no, status quo is not acceptable.
Thank you. I was remiss in not mentioning that for those of you who are viewing the event online, that if you have a question, you can put that question in the chat box on the page. And so please do that. And in the meantime, we'll go with questions in the audience here. Go right here. This microphone is coming around, so if you can just wait. And please just identify yourself and your affiliation.
So my name's Ryan. I'm with the Osgood Center for International Studies. And I was really interested, you touched very briefly on the relationship between North Korea and Russia. And I'm kind of curious if to expand on that. To what extent does the relationship that North Korea has with Russia and the conflict in Ukraine, how is that impacting the potential for peace? Thank you.
Thank you. That's, again, a very tricky question, but it's something that's very timely and relevant right now. How the situation in Ukraine affects the security situation on the Korean Peninsula.
Ukraine's one of the best things that ever happened to Kim Jong-un. It gave him a reason to be wanted. I mean, it's been unusual for North Korea to be able to offer anything. Russia needs North Korean artillery. So it puts them in a bargaining position with Putin. So temporarily, it's giving Kim Jong-un a lot of bargaining power with Putin. But I don't think this is a transitory relationship. I think if you look at the Russian-North Korean activities, what they've been doing, not just the declaration of their defense agreement, but activities over the past year, there's a lot more going on than just munitions. I think the North Koreans have decided that it's a good thing to have a relationship with someone other than China. Kim Il-sung was a master at playing China off against Russia. And I think Kim Jong-un's learning that lesson too.
And we've heard reports recently about how China has requested that all North Korean laborers return to the country. I don't know if that's a signal of displeasure, but we're seeing some interesting dynamics. Dan,
Yes.
Did you have anything to add?
I think there are likely, we can't prove that, likely some pretty interesting dynamics within the elites of North Korea on which side to go with. That's speculation.
All right, go right here.
Stanley Cover. What puzzles me, where does North Korea get the labor force to produce all these weapons, particularly the highly sophisticated ones like the missiles? They are not an industrial power by any commercial standard, yet they have this labor force. Where does it come from?
Good question. Maybe someone from the Korea Economic Institute could address a labor force issue.
I think.
Oh, all right.
I think there's some evidence that the technical element of the labor force came from elsewhere, from Europe, from the former Soviet bloc. They've got a population that has some element that is technically sophisticated. How they got there is a bit of a mystery, but they got there. And all you have to do is look at their hacking activities, because they're very capable in cybercrime and cyber espionage and all bad things cyber. So that exists. From my perspective, one of my assignments was as the second in command at Air Force Space Command. So I know a bit about challenges of missile launch and missile testing. The kind of a surprising thing is they're very failure tolerant. So if you're willing to fail, if you're willing to blow up a rocket or 12, you can learn the hard way. And they have done that. So they have some workforce that's technically sophisticated, and then they're willing to brute force their way to genuine capability.
And the North Korean economy is tiny. It's probably between $40 and $60 billion a year in GDP. It's the same size economy as Des Moines, Iowa. But if you devote all of your resources to a project like developing missiles, you can do it. They had outside help at first. Now they're doing it largely on their own. The mystery is not why it's developed so quickly, it's why it developed so slowly. Sanctions actually made it a lot harder for them to manage to do this. It's been decades they've been working on this project. So it wasn't quick and it wasn't easy, but they were very serious and focused on it. And as mentioned, they're probably the world's third most active cyber hacking country, cyber criminality. They just devoted themselves to doing it. You know, all of North Koreans' best students get drawn into the cyber force. So it's a matter of concentration.
More questions? Let's go right here. Front row right here.
My name is Jonathan Jang. I'm with the Political Violence Lab at the University of California. My question is, I understand that North Korea has traditionally been a background influence between China and the Russians ever since the USSR's collapse in 1991, and that China has traditionally supported North Korea with aid support. Given the ratification of the North Korean and Russian security agreement and on the power plays between China and Russia and North Korea, such as over the labor recall, how much autonomy does North Korea truly have over its own foreign policy, including its ability to go ahead with a possible peace conference to reunify the peninsula?
Just to clarify, you're asking how much control does North Korea have over its own foreign policy, given that China has such sway and influence over North Korea?
And to a degree, Russia as well in North Korean foreign policy.
Okay.
If I could answer, Frank, with anecdotal evidence only. I spent some time talking to folks in China, from China, and traveling to China to meet with officials and others there. And I always bring up North Korea because it's something I care deeply about. And the initial response is almost without exception, we don't have as much influence as you think to what the U.S. sees on Chinese influence on North Korea. It's so off-stated, there has to be some truth to it. And I think the emergence of the Russian relationship validates that.
I think the best line I've heard in this was from Tony Blinken. It was before he was Secretary of State, when he was at Carnegie. He said China has huge leverage over North Korea, but no influence. That's kind of captured it for me. The problem is China sees North Korea as being brittle. And they're afraid if they leaned on North Korea, actually sanctioned them, pressured them, the regime would fall. And China's biggest fear in the region is instability. So if North Korea can threaten by looking like they're unstable or weak, then they can do what they want. It's tough. I think that China is not happy with the direction things are going in the region. They're not happy with the Russian-North Korea closeness. And I don't think China is happy with being put in the same box with Russia as being part of an axis of countries that are cut off from the world economy. China wants to be part of the global world. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how China maneuvers to avoid being pulled by Russia into being an isolated country. That gives me some hope. It means China might be interested in international negotiations or helping in the region.
We have several more questions, so I want to make sure we get to them. So we'll go to the gentleman right there.
It seems to me one actor you haven't spoken much about is South Korea. Of course, the DPRK will say that the South Koreans are lackeys and do anything the Americans tell them to do, which I don't think history necessarily pours that out. It seems to be a vacillation from very aggressive actions by some South Korean conservative governments and then, of course, sunshine policies by more liberal governments. There also seems to be, as I read it, a growing sentiment in South Korea that we need to develop our own nuclear weapon system, and that seems to have a very high percentage, particularly amongst young people, to deter all these threats that continually rain down on us from the north. So can you speculate or talk a little bit about, I guess, the U.S.-South Korean relationship in an effort to try to square this circle as we go ahead? The new declaration, of course, the president being here and meeting with Mr. Biden was important. Trilateral agreements with the Japanese, very important. But how do you see that moving ahead?
Right, I think that's very important because, we talked about what influences U.S. policy, and one thing we didn't really address in our comments was that the U.S. is oftentimes catered to or lended its ear to South Korea because South Korea was its ally, right? And so we try to listen to the preferences of our ally, and sometimes when it's a conservative government, they tend to focus on certain things, and when it's a progressive government, they focus on other things, and we weigh those things against our own national security interests. But oftentimes when South Korea does not want the U.S. to engage with North Korea because they're engaged in a battle for legitimacy and competition, then we won't, right? And so that's a very important question. South Korea's role in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Who should go first on this one? Okay, I'll start.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay,
ahead,
all right. I'm a little bit heretical about this one. I don't think there's all that much difference between progressives and conservatives in South Korea when it comes to the alliance, or even dealing with North Korea. I think it's on the margins. I mean, South Korea's room for maneuver is not vast. So they'll emphasize human rights more or less. They'll emphasize U.S. deterrence more or less, but South Korea's been pretty steady. The U.S. has worked with both conservative and progressive governments, both on deterrence and on peace talks. It doesn't make all that much difference, I don't think. The difference now is South Korea is becoming part of this new community of nations. I'm getting back to multilateralism. South Korea's now been to the third NATO summit in a row. South Korea's likely to join the G7 before long. And so South Korea is looking beyond the peninsula for its own interest. I think South Korea sees North Korea as a nuisance, something to worry about, but they're looking at a wider world now. South Korea is much less focused North Korea than they used to be. And that's quite right. They're now one of the world's biggest economies.
I guess my response would be yes, but. Yeah, I think you're right that there's a fairly steady state role for South Korea that's becoming more global, but it's still consistent. I do think that the changes in government, the cycles of democracy for the U.S. and the Republic of Korea disrupt, they affect the continuity of strategic efforts to resolve the Korean War and move forward in engagement with North Korea. And when there's a transition, there's some time lost, whether it's a transition in the Korean government or a transition in the U.S. government. And that's part of the motivation that I have to advocate for a policy mandate from Congress that makes resolution a long-term goal that isn't administration dependent. Now, each administration will, if they're from different sides or even just different people, will approach it in different ways. But we do need some continuity to work through those disruptions in activity.
I would just add that contrary to the perceptions of some that the alliance is in better shape when there's a conservative South Korean government in power, the alliance has been largely rock steady throughout, right?
Yes.
But you have different fissures, right? So when it was the Progressive Moon administration, the fissure was largely surrounding the end of war declaration, and we were very cautious about that. Right. Today, it's more about restraint. We're concerned about some of the rhetoric and the things coming out of a hardline Korean government, and so we're trying to pull South Korea back a little bit from some of their aggressive tendencies, right? Let's go to some more questions, and then we'll go online as well. Wow, we have lots of questions. Let's go right here.
My name is Leo. I'm with the Osgood Center for International Studies as well. And the humanitarian issue in North Korea was mentioned a couple times. And I was wondering if there's any way that the U.S. or other countries can address it, even without this peace conference.
Not as things currently stand, I don't think. With we are to some degree dependent, we, the world community, on the willingness of the North Koreans just to accept assistance. So I'm afraid the answer currently is no.
There was some good small-scale work being done before COVID. There's some agricultural assistance, kind of technical level, soil sampling. There was a multi-drug resistant TB effort in North Korea. COVID put an end to that. North Koreans just wouldn't allow anybody in the country to remain. And they haven't really let them come back yet. I know there's some excellent NGOs that are eager to get in and try to help when North Korea will allow it.
I think there are two more questions up here. Let's go two at a time now, starting with the lady right here.
Hi, my name is Sloan. I'm also from the Osgood Center for International Studies, and I was curious about how you think the outcome of the upcoming election here in the U.S. in November may affect the relationship that the U.S. has with North Korea, and if the outcome could change priorities of the United States at all.
Hello, my name is Michael Fatt. I'm also from the Osgood Center for International Studies. And my question is, when regarding partnerships, especially when talking about North Korea and U.S. relations, are there any potential partners currently in this state of affairs or potentially in the future that would actually be really important to leveraging potential peace talks with North Korea? Thank you.
We need to invite Asan more just to increase our turnover.
Yeah. They've got a good road trip program, too, apparently. So the potential partners I mentioned were Vietnam and Mongolia. I think we need to broaden it beyond the usual suspects, if you will. Regarding the election, my hope is that whichever administration starts fresh in January, that North Korea, that the Korean Peninsula and addressing that becomes a greater priority. Understandably, there's a globe full of tough problems right now, but again, given the risk and the suffering, I would like to see North Korea and the Korean Peninsula elevated in terms of the importance to the next administration, whether it's Biden, Trump, or who knows.
Yeah, North Koreans are great planners. I can guarantee that somebody in Pyongyang now is sitting down plotting on what they're going to do for either election outcome. So I would expect that if Donald Trump is elected, they're going to send an extremely flowery congratulations note and then see what happens. And if President Trump wants to respond to diplomacy, I think North Koreans may try to re-engage. If he doesn't, they'll wait 4 years. They're patient. They'll just see what happens with that administration. Now, we talk about the fact that maybe a President Trump administration would be very domestically focused, but he's got an Asian summit coming up shortly after he's elected, if he is. So he'll be engaged in Asia, and that may be a time when North Koreans will try to reach out, do something. If President Biden is reelected, I think we're going to see a continuation of the solidification of international organizations, AUKUS, IPEF, the Quad, all those things, G7, all those things are going to become more vehicles for U.S. policy.
I agree. I think because of the familiarity of the two leaders, Kim Jong-un and Trump, with each other, that there's probably a natural inclination to explore continuation of talks. My concern is that, one, there isn't that natural intermediary like we had with President Moon in South Korea. Also, if they feel like they need leverage just to restart talks, will we see a sort of a sequel to Fire and Fury to allow both sides to save face to then return to talks? They may kind of wink at each other and say, hey, we know the song and dance we were playing, but again, in the game of security, these are risks that we can't play. I guess one more question here and then we'll go online.
Hello, my name is Eliza. I'm from State on the Korea desk. It's been about 3 months since the panel of experts was vetoed by Russia, and we still don't have a UN or any sort of sanctions monitoring body within. What type of solutions do you see to maybe fixing this kind of question that we have, or do you see just a no panel of experts for the considerable future?
Terrific question, and one that my organization, KEI, is actually quite focused on. We've had a meeting of former panel of experts members to talk about how to go forward, and we're going to do more on the subject. We need something to replace it. What that is not very clear. General Assembly could do it in the UN, but then you could still obstruct that. So how do you get an organization that would be a follow-up, that would have credibility and be seen as being neutral and would be high enough profile to attract support? It's tough. I think one of the big questions is whether to separate compliance from inspection. Because one of the difficulties of the last panel was countries that were being looked at by the panel of experts might be named and shamed. So do you need an organization that would just kind of help technically to countries that would like to enforce sanctions, but don't know how, and could use some assistance without exposing them to being accused of violating sanctions? So maybe you need to split it into a couple of functions, but work needs to be done.
Dan, anything you wanted to add on that?
Nope. I think we hit the expert answered, so I'll be quiet.
Yeah, my sense is that, I mean, there were some efforts, like you mentioned, some like a Syria-like mechanism through the UN General Assembly that kind of lost steam. My sense is that we'll probably see some more unilateral, bilateral, minilateral efforts, whether through the G7 or other like-minded countries, to enforce sanctions that way. But you're right, without the imprimatur of a multilateral body that gives their weight behind it, like the UN, you won't have the credibility, right? So let's go to online questions. Kemi, if you have any good ones lined up, please fire away.
Yeah, so we have one. What would addressing the North Korean issue internally specifically mean for the American government? That was the question.
One more time?
Yeah.
What would addressing the North Korean issue internally specifically mean for the American government?
Well, if I may, I think would have to mean something formal. In other words, not just an exchange of opinions. And in my paper that USIP was so gracious to publish in that essay on resolving the Korean War are a list of tasks, of topics to be addressed, and what the U.S. view is on them. I'll take a discrete one and throw that out as some of the work to be done. And that's boundaries, particularly the maritime boundaries. The maritime boundaries drawn up in the armistice and then modified thereafter are an aberration by current standards. So how does the U.S. feel about normalizing them, which should be part of any process beyond armistice? So it should be work-focused, lay the groundwork for actually replacing the armistice with a peace agreement within the U.S. internal U.S. government structure, not just as I said, an exchange of ideas.
Yeah, to circle back to Geneva for a minute, the closing hours of the Geneva conference were the United States had prepared a statement. We were going to say that the communists had tanked the talks. It was their fault. And then we're going to conclude it there. Before the U.S. could speak, Zhou Enlai took the microphone and said, let's adjourn this meeting and reconvene at a later date. And then there was pandemonium, because some of the UN states wanted to agree with Zhou Enlai to resume later. Some were against it. And so Anthony Eden, the chair, gavelled the meeting to an end, and that was it. So it's totally inconclusive. So you could resume the talks in theory. I spoke to a Chinese academic about that, and he said, actually, we wouldn't mind resuming Geneva talks with the parties that were at Geneva. And then he smiled and said, Japan wasn't there. So maybe it's possible.
And Mark, I think that highlights some of the work that the U.S. Needs to take on formally, consideration of standing and how they'd address that issue. And not save those discussions for the last minute when there's either an opportunity or a necessity to move forward.
I'll make one last point. So last year, in the commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the alliance, the U.S. and South Korea released a joint statement, and at the top of the statement, it said that the two leaders agreed that diplomacy was the only viable means for achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. But then the remainder of the document, and in addition, a whole separate document called, the Washington Declaration, focused on military deterrence, right? Increasing the size and scope of exercises, increasing the number of U.S. strategic asset deployments, and creating a U.S. nuclear consultative group, right? But we're not seeing the metrics, the deliverables, the outcomes to reflect the fact that diplomacy is the only viable means for achieving peace on the Korean Peninsula. So why don't we have metrics about the different types of creative ways we've outreached to North Korea, right? Why don't we have a U.S.-ROC consultative group on resolving the Korean War? These are some of the things I think we could also focus on that might help address the issue. I want to thank you, Mark and Dan, for joining us, as well as everyone else for coming to USIP. I also want to thank Kemi and the rest of our AV team for helping us out with this event. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you for listening to this event. If you'd like to listen to more events or explore our other podcasts, visit usip.org/podcasts.